Kansas City Sports Network. John Kurtz joins us with Craig and Paul. David Smoke. This is 365 Sports. We appreciate everybody. If you are watching, viewing, of course, same thing, or listening to us, or both. John, thank you very much for your time. Appreciate you making time for us. We want to get into Coach Klieman and all that, but that was a bruising on Saturday by what Arizona State did to Kansas State. Very impressive for Dillingham. It's a hell of a football team, but that was kind of a Kansas State beating of Kansas State, in my opinion. Would you agree?
Yeah, I would tend to, and I appreciate you guys having me on. Great to talk to you as always. I think there's kind of two routes here. Like, one, I try to remove myself as somebody who is much more K-State centric here and make sure that the proper credit is given to Kenny Dillingham, because I mean they came ready to play and they did smack K-State in the mouth, took full advantage of what K-State did give them, and that's an impressive win. And he's done a Big 12 Coach of the Year worthy job this year. He may not get it because of Kalani Sitake and Coach Prime, but he certainly in most years has done a job that is befitting of that. And I don't want to take anything away from that, because I think that's a big story. You know, I mean, Josh Pate, for instance, is going to the Arizona State BYU game this week, which to get somebody that SEC centric, especially this week, as much as he's stumping for the SEC, I think is pretty impressive and indicative of the job that Dillingham has done. So with that out of the way, I mean, yes, I think that was a pretty wretched performance from K-State. I made the comment at the game, like, I've never heard boos rain down like that at the stadium. And, you know, I've been going to games since literally 1989, the year that Bill Snyder showed up, and I was a student during the Ron Prince era. And I do not remember people booing like they did on Saturday at that, falling behind 21-0 at halftime, 24-0 at one point. You had two botched snaps, like two bad snaps on different field goals that cost them 6 points, which, as poorly as they played, actually would have made a massive difference and would have given them a chance to tie the game late on one of those drives had they just simply executed field goals. And they've got a kicker who's kicking it at all conference level, but they can't get the ball snapped. You know, they hired an NFL special teams coach this offseason and made a big deal about it. And 2 games in a row now, they've had multiple bad snaps. So, like, I don't know. You tell me how that actually happens. It just – things have really fallen apart. They were up 19-10 in the second half of the Houston game, in the fourth quarter of the Houston game, in a driving rainstorm, and it felt like, hey, if you just run, punt, and Houston's not going to be able to move the ball enough to score twice. They can't pass anyway, and now you can just load up the box run. Of course, K-State tries to throw, it gets picked off, and everything's been all downhill since then. But they're just really out of sorts right now. Obviously, you know, I think Chris Klieman's been a little bit distracted, and it was a weird press conference, you know, to be honest, after the game, where I think he was reflecting on some of that. So I don't know. You know, I think they have issues perhaps with the job that's being done at offensive coordinator right now as well. That's certainly a popular sentiment among the fan base. So look, they can still finish 9-3, and that would at least restore, you know, some level of order probably within the fan base and how people feel about the way things are going. But with what they've done now and missing out on the Big 12 championship game and college football playoff in all overwhelming likelihood, this season will definitely be viewed as a disappointment by most.
John, I know that, you know, I've seen in our chat or anything else, I mean, message board geniuses or whatever, and not to lump all those people in together because I know that they're different, but there's some anger at Chris Klieman right now. But is this just not a team that was ready for the next step, and maybe it's a next year thing now that they know kind of what their holes are?
Well, that was sort of my take on it coming into the year. Is I was like, hey, if you look at the roster, like, especially with a starting quarterback as young as Avery Johnson is, you know, next year might be the year where you would expect the big jump in this team to really be a big-time contender. But the problem is, in the portal era, it's really hard to count on that. You know, I mean, it's just hard to hang on to your roster. It's hard to know. There's so much volatility that the mindset has to turn a little bit more to like, hey, we've got to do it right now because you never know what's going to happen. You know, I mean, we've been getting pounded with the questions from people like, you know, what's going to happen in the portal? Are they going to lose guys? last year's team, had that Iowa State game at the end of the year where right before the game, like that Saturday, they knew that they were not going to be playing for a Big 12 championship. And it felt like some of the guys on that team checked out. And, guys like Will Lee, who was playing corner, just go watch the highlights. You can see how much it looked like he wanted to be there, and he was out the door, and now is at Texas A&M. You had some situations like that on that team, and I think you fear it, and this is not a K-State specific problem, by the way. It's just for anybody now. If you don't accomplish what the goal was for the team that year, are you going to get that same effort, and are guys going to be checked out and ready to hit the portal? So I think that's the concern with it. Like, I think it's a fair take to have on it kind of in a vacuum, but with the circumstances of the sport right now, you just always wonder how all that is going to go down. I mean, having said all that, like, I think quarterback, as much as anything, is as indicative of kind of what you're saying. Like, hey, Avery Johnson probably needed a year here to really fine-tune things before he would be ready to take off and go and truly lead a team to the college football playoff, and I think that's true. We've seen some flashes. If you compare his numbers, he compares pretty favorably to most of the quarterbacks in that class. It's just that it takes guys time, I mean, look at like the situation with Rayola at Nebraska, starts off really hot and tails off a little bit. Nico at Tennessee, like it's hard for quarterbacks that young to be really consistent throughout an entire season. And that's definitely been the case with Avery. I also just think the team is kind of young in a lot of spots. And, some of their best players like DJ Giddens, who is older, is literally about the quietest guy that you will ever meet. So they just, I don't know if they have like the leadership, the guys that are necessary to really stem the tide when things are going poorly in a driving rainstorm at Houston in a game that you should probably win. Or, you throw an early interception and get a bad call go against you at the Arizona State game. All of a sudden you're down 7-0. Klieman even said it in his post-game press conference. They just haven't been good at stopping bad momentum when it happens early in a game. Go back to the BYU game. They have one turnover. It turns into like 3 and just an avalanche of points in a 6-minute span from BYU because they just couldn't stop the bleeding. So I think some of that is them just being young, not having a ton of leadership in those spots. So it'll be a real test. Chris Klieman likes to talk about the culture of the program, and it seems like it's been pretty good, but I do think it's definitely going to be tested now in the coming weeks, and then looking at what happens in the offseason.
John, I almost thought that was their last home game last Saturday just because of how emotional Chris Klieman was and talking about the seniors and all that, but they do get this final home game here against Cincinnati. Your thoughts on what you've seen from the Bearcats, and I guess you'd be nervous no matter who's lining up against K-State right now because of recent results, but how much do you worry about Cincinnati coming and playing spoiler and really ruining the feeling around Manhattan right now?
Yeah, it's fair to say. I mean, right now, the way that they have played the last 2 weeks, they're capable of losing to about anybody in the conference for sure. So, yeah, Cincinnati more than capable of doing that. They were right there with Iowa State into the fourth quarter. I think the final score looks a little bit better for the Cyclones than what it actually was. So they're game enough to do it. I don't know. And on the press conference thing, I think some of that is Klieman realizing that he had to spend some time away, I believe, from the team during the bye week because of some family stuff that he has going on. And I think he felt bad that it appeared that the team wasn't very well prepared because of that, and he felt bad for the older guys on the team that they weren't going to be able to play for a Big 12 championship or go to the college football playoff. And I think that's what kind of sparked a lot of that. But it was unexpected. It was definitely unexpected from most of us in the room when that happened. So, yeah, the tough part about this is, like I just mentioned, this is a program that the last 3 or 4 years has had the expectation like we are going to compete for a Big 12 championship. And so when that doesn't happen and then you've still got games left on the schedule, what kind of an effort are you going to give? All right, now throw in the layer that not that Cincinnati is some terrible program, but it's not a program that you have any connection with. It's not a program that you have any juice with. I think this is another issue with just the state of college football right now in conference realignment. Like Cincinnati's 5-5, right? Okay, Nebraska's 5-5. If Nebraska were coming in here, even if you knew that you weren't making the Big 12 championship game, but you've got a regional rivalry and a history and the fans really care about it, there would be, I think, more of an impetus for the team to get up and be fired up for the game, but you just don't have that. And that's one of the things that everybody is going to deal with at some point or another because of what conference realignment has done to the sport. So unfortunately, I just think it's a pretty good example of that with the game that K-State has. I worry certainly about Sorsby and his legs. He did a great job, obviously, running against Iowa State, and K-State's had trouble stopping mobile quarterbacks this year. Sam Leavitt really made some key plays with his feet and even just throwing on the run a couple of times in that game. And Leavitt, I talked about quarterbacks from that class. He's in the same class as Avery Johnson and obviously way outplayed him last week. So it's not like you're always getting up and down efforts. Sam Leavitt's been pretty good. But that would be one of my real fears. It's Sorsby combined with just the general malaise that you could get out of K-State in this game because it's a team they don't have ties to, and how much are those guys going to care if they know that it's not necessarily going to be playing for what their ultimate goal was this year.
Klieman even mentioned that I am not going anywhere. I'm not going to retire or whatever. And I know if it's a family issue, it's a private issue, that's fine. But it was enough to where he had to even mention that or was even asked about it. Is everything okay with him?
Yeah, I'll take him at his word. Tim Fitzgerald asked the question to him. Fitz is about as good as it gets on the beat in terms of being somebody that's tight with Chris Klieman. There were definitely rumors that were flying around after the press conference, but you also have to think back to, he had an incident earlier in the season. I'm trying to remember if that was I feel like it was the Kansas game, where he had some dizzy spells on the sideline. Yeah. And so I think a lot of people started connecting that together and being like, okay, is that, but that's not what this is. Like I said, it is a family issue that popped up right before the Houston game that he's had to deal with here. So, I don't know. I will say he's always a guy. I don't think it's a particularly well-kept secret that he's a guy that doesn't want to be coaching like Bill Snyder into his late 70s or 80s. And you combine that with the way just the game is rapidly changing, and we're seeing a lot of these coaches, like Tony Bennett, just say, to hell with this. I'm not going to deal with the portal and NIL and everything. So if you're more in that kind of mode, it can certainly wear on you. And when you combine that with, hey, family issues coming up, hey, I had dizziness on the sideline, this is where I think people started to get that idea that maybe that's coming sooner rather than later. But I certainly have not heard anything credible or definitive that is going to happen, but I understand where the speculation came from based on all that. So, do I expect him to be the coach in 10 years there? No, certainly not. I don't know. If you started pinning me down below that, I guess maybe it's not fair to fully speculate on that, but I don't think that he's a guy that's going to be doing it for a super long time. And you know what? I definitely respect that.
John, do you think that he will make any coaching staff changes, particularly on offense where, and granted, look, Colin Klein is one of your own, right? They're going to love him no matter what. He's in the free beer for life in Manhatten Club. That's not in question. So you lose him. You're obviously not going to like the next guy as much, but does he maybe make a change offensively, or does he like where they are? It's just an experience thing like we talked about earlier.
Yeah, I think that's kind of the $1 million question heading into the off season. Klieman has always been very, to a fault, sometimes loyal and slow to make changes, especially when they're his guys, which they generally have been. And that was the case with Courtney Messingham, who was the offensive coordinator before Colin Klein. Fans were not big fans of Courtney Messingham the entire time that he was there. And it felt like it was probably a year too late that he made the change there. It took a really bad game in Austin in 2021 that they should have won against Texas and really blew. And there was just some very questionable play calling at the end of that game. And it was one of those moments where it kind of felt like, all right, man, if it's ever going to happen, it has to happen now. Well, then he promotes from within, which, is Colin Klein, who was right there, kind of fell into his lap and turned into a star as an offensive coordinator, worked out great. And credit Klieman for making that move, by the way, because Courtney Messingham was his best friend. And that's something Chris Klieman's a very sensitive guy. I think he's a very good person. And definitely is more empathetic than a lot of coaches are. And so that's a part of why his attitude is the way that it is. But I think that's also been a frustration for fans. Like, why not make more of these moves? The coaching staff, I do think some things have gotten stale. They've had a lot of guys on the staff for a while that fans have really questioned. But most of the time when he's made a move, it's been just an internal hire. He lost Scotty Hazelton as defensive coordinator after year one, promotes from within with Joe Klanderman. That, I think, has turned out pretty well. I think he's done a pretty good job. Helped him win a Big 12 championship. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. But I think the fans would look at it and say, well, our frustration here is that, one, you don't make moves quick enough. You're not cutthroat enough. And that's why we're stuck at this kind of 8-9 win ceiling most of the time and have only broken through once for the Big 12 championship. I think that's what a lot of fans would tell you. There might be some truth in that, but I also think sometimes him staying the course has probably been better than being overly reactionary. So I say all that to say the fans desperately want to change an offensive coordinator. I do think that it feels like Connor Riley's been figured out a little bit, who is the OC this year, that about halfway through the year. I mean, midway through the Big 12 season, they were the number one offense in points per drive in the league. And it seemed like, all right, things are going fine. But since then, they have not been able to run the ball. DJ Giddens has really struggled. Avery Johnson has kind of fallen back into some of the early season habits. And they're 10th now in points per drive in the league. So it's been a pretty big fall over the last month. And it just feels like he hasn't had an adjustment when enough film got out there from other teams. Now, that's me as just a guy sitting on my couch watching it, media guy in the press box, whatever. Maybe coaches would tell me something different, but that's kind of my perception right now. And the other dynamic is, you've got a really high-profile quarterback. What's he going to think? What's he going to want? And how would that factor into everything? So I think it's a complicated decision. I don't know what I really expect Chris Klieman to do, but I think it's not going to be as knee-jerk reactionary as a lot of fans really want. I mean, frankly, a lot of people have floated now for a while, like, hey, you've got Matt Wells on staff, and Wells has been down on the field talking to Avery Johnson in his headset and then on the sideline, whereas Connor Riley's been up in the booth calling plays. A lot of people have said, well, why not during the bye week flip those two and have Wells go back up to the booth, be more of the guy calling plays. He's been an offensive coordinator before, obviously. Connor Riley's an offensive line coach. The offensive line appears to be struggling. Have him down there where he can get down in their face, and that's just not something that Chris Klieman's wanted to do in the middle of the season. Not surprising to me, but I understand why people were asking for it.
John, before we let you go here, your thoughts, another playoff ranking show tonight. Will be interesting to see where BYU falls and just sort of where Colorado, for example, is positioned. But your thoughts on another chaotic and entertaining weekend in the Big 12, but a lot of self-inflicted wounds and just kind of the big picture when it comes to the league and its bigger aspirations.
Yeah, my thoughts are Kansas must be stopped. We've got to put an end to what Lance Leipold is trying to do to the conference right now. I kid. I mean, a heck of an effort by them, and honestly one that felt really telegraphed. Like, you could see that coming a mile away. Yeah. BYU's been playing with fire too much, and Colorado honestly feels to me like it felt the last couple of weeks like Colorado had been playing the best of anybody in the conference right now. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it gets the Boise part of this discussion is going to get really frustrating, I think, or at least just stressful for Big 12 fans for a while, tracking will your conference champion be able to finish higher in the college football playoff poll than Boise to be able to get an auto bye? And then, even keep an eye on Army, too. I know that's like the nightmare scenario for both the Big 12 or ACC, because the same thing could happen to the ACC. But if you wind up with a 3-loss conference champion somehow with a bunch of chaos, and Army beats Notre Dame and wins out, and then you got Army and Boise there, could you get totally left out of the thing? I don't think that we'll have to explore that too deeply, because I think they will lose this weekend. But, I don't expect a lot of kindness from the committee, to be completely honest, on the BYU thing. Felt like a lot of people had just been really waiting for a reason to drop them. I know that the committee actually was pretty forgiving to BYU last week by putting them all the way up at 6. But I think they're going to take a pretty stark fall, and the Big 12 and maybe the ACC too, frankly, are going to have to play this game of like looking at, all right, where are we at, and where are those pesky Boise State Broncos at?
Yep, it should be fun tonight. Who knows? They also could just be like messing with people. You never know. Although they shouldn't be doing that, I think they kind of enjoy doing that. Thank you very much, John. Great stuff as always. John Kurtz, his podcast as well, covers the heck of the Big 12. Remember, he also has his newsletter that's out. If you haven't seen that, you can also get that by getting a hold of John Kurtz.